Jericho, called the City of Palms by ancient biblical writers, is one of the oldest cities in the world. For 10,000 years, this desert oasis has been fed by a running spring whose waters have never ceased to flow. All that remains today of this ancient city is a massive mound, and yet for more than 100 years, archaeologists have directed their attention to this barren spot because this ruin may hold the key to a great mystery, a mystery centered around the biblical dating of Joshua's arrival at Jericho.
In my view, Jericho was destroyed probably by fire as a result of a military siege and campaign under the Egyptians around 1500.
If this date is accurate, then most biblical scholars have a problem attributing these ancient walls of Jericho to Joshua and the Israelites.
There was no occupied site around 1250, 1225, if the Israelites came that way, and therefore the story was invented, shall we say, by the later biblical writers.
But not all scholars agree. In fact, there was quite a different opinion when Jericho was first excavated.
The first major excavation at the site of Jericho was a German excavation between 1907 and 1909. They found the outer wall of the city that we can date to the time of Joshua and the Israelite conquest.
Almost 50 years later, a renowned British archaeologist, Dame Kathleen Kenyon, would return to the site. She concluded that Jericho was indeed destroyed, but that it happened 250 years before Joshua's time. In fact, according to Kenyon, Jericho was uninhabited at the time Joshua and the Israelites arrived. And so with this discovery, we have two seemingly irreconcilable ideas. What is the special mystique of Jericho, this most ancient of all cities, that calls to us from across time? Jericho was tantalizingly close, but just out of reach from the man who led his people from slavery in Egypt. Moses would never enter the Promised Land because he had lost trust in the Lord. The Bible tells us God instructed Moses to speak to the rock to bring forth water. But Moses, instead of speaking a command, struck the rock. But God would allow Moses to view the Promised Land from the top of Mount Nebo.
Look at the land with your own eyes, since you are not going to cross this Jordan. But commission Joshua and encourage and strengthen him, for he will lead this people across and will cause them to inherit the land that you will see. Deuteronomy 3:27.
And so it is written that Moses died on top of Mount Nebo at the age of 120. It is then that God speaks to Joshua and encourages him to stay true to his calling.
Be strong and courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Joshua 1:7.
Joshua is about to take on the central task of his life, delivering the Israelites into the Promised Land. In order to do this, he would have to conquer the inhabitants of this land, the Canaanites. To Joshua, what lay beyond the Jordan River was a mystery, and God's help notwithstanding, laden with danger. What kind of land and what kind of people were Joshua and his Hebrew slaves about to take on? In Egypt in 1887, a major archaeological discovery known as the Amarna tablets give us a looking glass into what Joshua could not yet see. That time, that place that was the Promised Land. The Amarna tablets contain a series of letters dating back to just before Joshua's time. They were written by various kings and princes in Canaan, to the Pharaoh of Egypt. The Amarna tablets tell us Canaan was made up of small city-states, each quarreling with its neighbor, each ruled by its own king. Warfare between these small kingdoms was common, and chaos prevailed throughout the country.
The Canaanite religion required these peasants to constantly be providing offerings to the temples in these various urban areas. So there's almost a sense in which you've got a kind of urban elite as opposed to the rural peasantry providing the foodstuffs, the grains, the oils, and the livestock for the urban elite to maintain their lifestyle. Into this situation comes Joshua and his former slaves from Egypt.
As Joshua and the Israelites were about to enter the Promised Land, the balance of power was changing in the Middle East. Internal weaknesses in Egypt had forced the Egyptians to withdraw from the land of Canaan, leaving the warring city-states in the Promised Land to fend for themselves. It was approximately 1225 BCE. At the same time, across the Atlantic Ocean in the Americas, wild corn was first discovered and cultivated into maize. The people of the Far East first learned of the chariot, where it was modified. And in Troy, the great Trojan War took place, celebrated in Homer's Iliad, with its telling of the Trojan horse with soldiers hidden inside.
And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses." Joshua 3:7.
And so the Lord instructs Joshua to tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant to go down to the river Jordan and stand at the edge. As soon as their feet touch the water, the river stops flowing, and the whole nation crosses the Jordan on dry land, just as they had 40 years before at the Red Sea. Another miracle? Or is there some other explanation?
When an earthquake strikes just right, the banks of the Jordan River will be dislodged and deposited in the riverbed and will actually dam up the Jordan River. It's happened a number of times in recorded history. The most recent time in 1929, when the river was blocked up, dammed up for 20 hours. So that's an indication that at the time of the Israelite crossing of the Jordan River, there was earthquake activity.
After crossing the river and entering the Promised Land, the Israelites set up camp just north of Jericho.
Jericho was a known city. It was a city that had a famous wall already in Joshua's time. And to take that city first would be a very impressive beginning. They had to start off with a bang because they had no experience of fighting at all, really. And so in order to believe that this land was really promised to them, I think they had to start off with a resounding triumph.
Joshua does as God commanded. The Israelites march around the walls of the city for 7 days, and on the 7th day they march around 7 times, with 7 priests blowing 7 trumpets. And then the people of Israel give out with a shout, and the walls of the city collapse. The Israelites sack the city, killing all the inhabitants, setting it on fire.
The circling of the cities, the blowing of the shofar, the trumpets, the number 7 again, the 7 priests, the 7 times around, the 7 days, all of these have to do with the liturgy of the worship of ancient Israel and have nothing to do with military tactics whatsoever.
Some scholars believe that the walls of Jericho collapsed as a result of a powerful earthquake.
When the Israelites marched around the city that 7th time and those walls came down, that undoubtedly it was earthquake activity at that time as well.
If there was an earthquake, that doesn't explain to me why it was so well timed that Joshua's troops happened to be outside when it happened. So I'm not sure, even if you get a scientific explanation, that you've managed to clear up the mystery.
The fall of Jericho may prove to be one of the Bible's central mysteries, but it is only one. How did the Israelites emerge victorious in the Promised Land? How were they able to achieve one seemingly miraculous victory after another? When we return, beyond Jericho with Joshua and his newly born army, as they set into battle for the Promised Land.
In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. Otherwise they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshipping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 20:16.
At Jericho, Joshua follows this command to the letter. With the exception of the prostitute Rahab, who sheltered Joshua's spies, not a soul, no man, woman, or child, is left alive at Jericho.
The conquest of Jericho as a religious event involved certain religious obligations. One of those obligations was the dedication of all the living things of that city to God as a kind of sacrifice. In addition to the offering of every living thing, you were also supposed to forswear taking any prizes, any booty, anything at all.
One of the features of the book of Joshua that has bothered a lot of Jews and Christians is the way in which Joshua is commanded to slaughter all of the Canaanites. And some verses says that he does that, and yet other verses indicate that he didn't, but should have. According to my way of understanding this as a social movement within Canaan, there certainly was violence, but it was a violence more like civil war or insurrection between one group of the populace and another group.
It is not just the vanquished dead the Israelites leave behind. All objects of value are left behind for the Lord. Not one precious thing is to be taken from Jericho. Now Joshua turns to the northwest, to the city of Ai, a strategic point because it is located in the highlands of the interior. Joshua sends spies deep into Canaan to scout the countryside.
When they returned to Joshua, they said, "Not all the people will have to go up against Ai. Send 2,000 or 3,000 men to take it, and do not weary all the people, for only a few men are there." Joshua 7:3.
Joshua sends 3,000 men into battle, and they suffer a humiliating defeat. The men of Ai chase the Hebrew survivors into the Judean wilderness. When Joshua learns of this disaster, he falls face down before the Ark of the Covenant, beseeching the Lord for an explanation.
The Lord said to Joshua, "Stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction." Joshua 7:10.
Apparently, someone in the Israelite camp had violated an injunction of the holy war and kept booty for himself. The next morning, Joshua summons the Israelites and orders a camp-wide search. Achan, one of Joshua's soldiers, comes forward and admits his sin. Then, as it was written, all of Israel stones Achan to death, along with his entire family, and burns their bodies with the forbidden loot Achan had hidden away.
Now, the interesting thing about this, of course, is that the sin of one person holds up the entire campaign. In terms of military rationale, this story makes no sense. I mean, why should the taking of a little bit of booty have anything to do with the military conduct of a battle? But you see, that's not what the writer is trying to say. The writer is trying to say that this is a religious event. And so you must observe all the religious elements that are a part of that event. And one of them is, if you've dedicated something to God, it is God's, and God's alone, including everything in that city.
Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you, and go up and attack Ai. For I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land." Joshua 8:1.
Joshua executes a classic military maneuver. For the taking of Ai, Joshua deploys a small force in a valley to the west, while he and his soldiers make a frontal assault at daybreak. The soldiers of Ai come charging out after Joshua, leaving their city utterly defenseless. The Israelite force storms the city and sets it afire. Seeing their city in flames, the men of Ai turn back, but they are trapped between two flanks of the Israelite army. As God foretold, the Israelites now have a foothold in the central mountains of Canaan, the Promised Land.
I think that Joshua, in his battle strategy, relied first of all on numbers, second on some help from within Canaan, third on some battle deception, as we see in particular with Ai, with the city of Ai, where they feint an attack and the real attack comes from elsewhere. And fourth, and I would say most importantly, on the powerful motivation of believing they were fighting for their destiny and for God's cause.
The terrible fate of Jericho and the city of Ai is about to befall the wealthy city of Gibeon, as Joshua and the Israelites turn to the southeast. But did that fate occur the way the Bible would have it? Scholarly investigation of the silent but eloquent ruins of Jericho and Ai suggests these cities were destroyed just the way the Bible tells it, but hundreds of years before Joshua would have gotten there. When we return, a look at how pottery shards may hold the key to the ancient puzzle of Jericho.
Every man charged straight in and took the city. Joshua 6:20.
Jericho is the center of the debate which has preoccupied scholars throughout the 20th century. For the ruins of Jericho tell us from across time that the city was indeed destroyed, as it is described in the Bible. The question is when and by whom.
Archaeologists excavated at a number of sites that are mentioned in the book of Joshua and began to realize that there was a problem, because some of the sites were destroyed, but not at the same time, according to the way archaeologists are able to determine dates.
The first excavation of Jericho was in 1867. Ever since, scholars have probed deeper into Jericho's past, with one conclusion seeming to contradict the next.
Jericho's been excavated 4 times, in fact, around the turn of the century, first by Germans, and then it was excavated in the 1920s and 1930s by a British excavator, John Garstang, and then more recently in the 50s by the late Dame Kathleen Kenyon. The early German expedition didn't produce a lot that we can use today, but the Garstang expedition produced evidence of a city wall that had been violently destroyed by fire, and Garstang pronounced this the walls that Joshua and his men brought tumbling down, and that view is still found in the handbook.
This dramatic confirmation of biblical history made international news. But 20 years later, a British archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, journeys to ancient Jericho. In an often serious and scholarly occupation, Kenyon bursts on the scene as a refreshing individual.
I happen to have known her quite well. She was also a wonderful character, colorful character, controversial most of her life. She was very independent, and her own dig is not, I think, to be connected with Garstang's dig. In fact, she overturned most of his conclusions with more modern methods.
After 6 years of excavation, Kenyon challenges Garstang's celebrated discovery.
Now, I would say we do not have pottery of the late 13th century. Now, the snag about this is, if I take it, and I do, that the destruction of this late Bronze Age town was about 1400. It is too early to fit in with any of the probable dates of the flight or expulsion from Egypt, which probably was about 1250.
Both Garstang and Kenyon did agree the city of Jericho was destroyed, for the most part, as told in the Bible. What they disagreed on was the date of this event. And this is what troubles biblical scholars.
I would have to say that Garstang was correct in his dating in the 1930s. Kenyon was wrong in the 1950s, and we have to go back to Garstang's dating. Once you do that, then we find that the archaeological findings there at Jericho synchronize precisely with the biblical story.
But for the moment at least, this seems to be the minority viewpoint among scholars. Pottery shards found at Jericho are the clue to dating the destruction of this city. The presence of this Cypriotic pottery suggests the city was destroyed at least 200 years before Joshua ever arrived there.
It's standard pottery of the Middle Bronze Age, which ends around 1500 in a series of destructions which most of us believe were caused by the Egyptians, not at all by the Israelites.
For the Lord has given you the city. The city, all that is in it, are to be devoted to the Lord. Joshua 6:16.
One of the biggest mysteries to me is the way people interpret the Bible literally. And I think it has to do with the rise of science, so that actually people are looking for religious foundations that are scientific.
But there is further archaeological evidence at Jericho, tantalizing in its seeming support of the Bible. As the evidence is examined, one can almost hear the echo of ancient trumpets.
Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. Joshua 6:24.
Even when a city is conquered and set on fire, normally the grain would be taken out. It would be plundered by the conquering king. But in this case, it wasn't. It was left there to be burned up. Both Garstang and Kenyon found vast quantities of grain in large clay jars. In almost every building that was excavated, they found quantities of this grain. Well, why was that grain there? Well, the answer comes from the biblical story, because in that story, the Israelites were commanded not to plunder the city.
Another mystery of Jericho revolves around the prostitute named Rahab. Before Joshua even approaches the city, he dispatches 2 spies who find their way to Rahab's house.
She hides them, protects them, directs the king's men away from them, and then after the king's men have left, she arranges a covenant or a treaty with them that they will spare her and her family when they do take the city.
Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. Joshua 6:16.
Rahab being inside the city and helping the Israelites shows that there was already inside Canaan a tendency of certain Canaanites to welcome the outside conquerors. It is possible that Rahab helped because she felt an outcast in Canaanite society, and so she saw the Israelites as liberators.
Because of Rahab's role in Joshua's conquest of Jericho, archaeologists have long searched these ruins for evidence of her existence. According to the Bible, the house of Rahab was built directly against the walls of Jericho.
So she let them down by rope through the window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. Joshua 2:15.
The biblical story mentions a house occupied by one Rahab, a lady of the evening, but in fact there is no evidence of any such specific house in the archaeological record. On the contrary, there are no houses at Jericho that we know of in the 13th century. So I think looking for Rahab's house would be rather like looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack.
Well, if the city walls came down, how could her house have been preserved? Again, archaeology gives us the answer. When the Germans excavated at the northern end of the tell, they found for a short distance that the city wall was preserved, that it did not fall at this particular point. And in fact, there were houses built right up against the city wall at this point, and possibly one of them is Rahab's house.
No evidence remains to tell us this 10-foot section of Jericho's wall still standing was the home of Rahab. The archaeological evidence seems at times to support and at the same time to contradict the Bible's telling of Joshua and the destruction of Jericho. But Joshua's campaign was not limited to Jericho. When we return, a search through the ruins of the ancient city of Ai, a city central to Joshua's quest for the Promised Land. In their campaign for the Promised Land, Joshua and the Israelites travel west to the interior city of Ai. As with Jericho, God commands that Ai is to be completely destroyed.
So Joshua burned Ai and made it a permanent heap of ruins, a desolate place to this day. Joshua 8:28.
The city of Ai is another one of those mysteries of the Bible. Now, there is a site in central Canaan called Et Tel, which scholars believe is the location of Ai. The problem is, there was no occupation there for about 1,000 years, from the end of the early Bronze period until you get down into the Iron Age. And this was, of course, the time when the Israelites came into the land during the late Bronze Age. And so at that time, there was no occupation at Et Tel. So is this ancient Ai or not? And that's the mystery.
The excavations at Ai by French archaeologist Judith Marquet-Krauss in 1933 resulted in the same mysterious question posed about the ruins of Jericho. It seemed that a major destruction had taken place here, very much the way the Bible tells it, but fully 1,200 years before the time of Joshua. Were the biblical writers giving us Joshua's conquest of Ai as it actually happened? Or were they creating Joshua's story by borrowing from Ai's ancient past?
There are a lot of specific details in the story of Joshua, some of which, my guess is, are at variance with the exact historical circumstances, some of which are a little mythologized, some of which, in the years of telling, have probably been fuzzed up a little. My sense is that the Bible presents a realistic view, although I don't look to it for scientific accuracy. I don't think that's its aim. I look to it for spiritual depth.
He hung the king of Ai on a tree and left him there until evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered them to take his body from the tree and throw it down at the entrance of the city gate. And they raised a large pile of rocks over it, which remains to this day. Joshua 8:29.
In the late 1960s, Professor Joseph Callaway discovers a pile of stones at Et Tel, which seems to confirm this location as the ancient city of Ai.
Callaway's excavation revealed that there was indeed a huge pile of stones in front of the gate, except the huge pile of stones didn't hide a king's body underneath, but rather it was a collapsed gate tower from this ancient Canaanite city. Whoever made up this story about Ai saw the city when the ruins of the old Canaanite city were there and the ruins of the Israelite village were there, and he was really telling a realistic story.
In scientific terms, this is what is known as etiology, a story told in order to explain a phenomenon or condition already in existence. Were the people setting down the book of Joshua borrowing from what was already there?
When I first came to Ai, it struck me that the story that we have in Joshua could only have been told about this particular site. There was a number of specific pieces of topographical information in the story. For example, the forces of Joshua coming up from Jericho and concealing themselves where the people of the city couldn't see them. Well, that was possible at this site. Remember, all it takes is one person to tell a good story, and a good story bears repeating. The later historians simply said, well, I've heard the story so many times, it must be true.
Is it possible the story of Ai got into the Bible's immortal pages in this way? It is a provocative mystery, unanswered to this day. And yet in the north lies another city in Joshua's path, a city whose ruins seem to validate the Bible's telling: Hazor. As they continue their conquest, Joshua, the master of deception, would himself be fooled by the city of Gibeon. The Bible tells us the people of Gibeon, a rich Canaanite town just southwest of Ai, had heard about Joshua's victories. Fearing for their lives, the Gibeonites dressed in tattered clothes and approached the Israelites at the campsite of Gilgal. Saying they have come from a faraway land, the Gibeonites ask for a treaty of peace. After questioning them at length, Joshua agrees and makes a covenant. It is 3 days later that Joshua learns he had been tricked. Nevertheless, he stands by his covenant and spares the Gibeonites.
Here's a town which wasn't conquered at all, but in fact, through subterfuge, basically tricked their way into becoming a part of Joshua and Joshua's people.
I think that the story is there not only perhaps because the Gibeonite story reflects a certain historical reality, but the Bible tells about the Gibeonites, I think, to show that Joshua kept his promises, even though they were exacted under trickery.
It is now that one of the greatest miracles associated with Joshua and the conquest of the Promised Land takes place. The Bible tells us that the kings of 5 powerful city-states near Gibeon are enraged when they hear of that city's covenant with Israel. They combine forces, march northward, and attack Gibeon. Joshua comes to the rescue, leading his men into the hill country at night and taking the coalition army by surprise at dawn. At the end of a long day's battle, the sun begins to set, threatening Joshua's victory. Joshua turns to the Lord for help.
Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, O sun, stand still over Gibeon, O moon over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies. Joshua 10:12.
The Lord responds. The day is miraculously prolonged, and Joshua has his victory. His campaign in southern and central Canaan now complete, Joshua turns to the north, where the kingdoms are united under the powerful city-state of Hazor, some 10 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. When we return, the ancient city of Hazor, a modern warrior archaeologist, and ruins that seem to support the Bible and its telling.
Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. Everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anything that breathed. And he burned up Hazor itself. Joshua 11:10.
It is Joshua's final conquest, the northern campaign. As written in the Bible, the king of Hazor brings all the kings of the north together to fight against the Israelites. Joshua does as the Lord commanded and defeats them at the waters of Merom.
Well, again, the Israelites were victorious. They went against the city of Hazor, even though it was heavily fortified. They were able to defeat the city, and we're told they set the city on fire. And so with that one victory there, they were able to defeat a coalition of kings, actually, and a coalition of armies, and that gave them control over the whole northern territory, the area we call Galilee. And this more or less completed the conquest of Canaan.
The ancient city of Hazor was excavated by the celebrated Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin, the former commander of modern Israel's Air Force. Yadin probed into Israel's ancient battles, beginning in the 1950s. In the course of 5 seasons of digging, the Israeli archaeologist would find evidence of violent destruction at Hazor, destruction which he unhesitatingly attributed to Joshua.
Whenever I visit again this place, I'm struck again by this fact that I know that 1 foot below the place where I'm walking now, there is further evidence for the destruction of Hazor by Joshua.
Yadin's excavation reveals layers of ash, proving Hazor had met its end in fire. The Mycenaean pottery Yadin unearthed was in common use in Canaan throughout the 13th century, but was no longer imported in the next century. This gave Yadin the date for Hazor's destruction. In addition, the various temples and sanctuaries excavated at Hazor showed signs of having been deliberately defaced, complete with beheading of its statues, what the Bible calls graven images.
Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods, and wipe out their names from those places. Deuteronomy 12:2.
It was precisely what Yadin would find at Hazor 3,000 years later. So here, unlike the ruins of Jericho and Ai, archaeology seems to support the Bible's telling of the story of Joshua.
Archaeology is full of mysteries. I think the lay view, the popular view, is that we archaeologists have answered all the questions. In most cases, we've raised new questions.
So the question remains, how did the children of Israel attain their promised land?
And if there was no conquest of the land, how is it that people later on came to think of themselves as Israelites? And if there were no outsiders who came into the land, so who were these people who claimed to be Israelites who came from the outside?
There are a few different opinions. The first follows the outline in the book of Joshua. The Israelites came into the promised land and conquered it. The second view, which developed early in this century, explains that the Israelites were peaceful infiltrators. They were nomadic immigrants who integrated over a period of time among the Canaanites. As they declined in power, the Israelites grew stronger.
My own view is that neither of these interpretations is very adequate, and that what we more likely have here is a situation of local peoples, certain classes and types of Canaanites. They include peasants and herders and bandits and mercenaries. And what we have here is a whole sector of people who are dissenting from and withdrawing from the dominant Canaanite city-states. And so the refusal of these people to be taxed and to serve in a king's army and to speak of having only one Lord, namely Yahweh, even if this was an invisible Lord, has a social class dimension to it, in my view.
This theory has come to be known as the peasant revolt theory. The poor people revolted against the corrupt and oppressive Canaanite city-states they lived within. They were looking for a better life, and Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, promised them that.
No one knows exactly where the Israelites came from, but there is a theory that they were of the same extraction as the Canaanites. One of the mysteries of the book of Joshua is how did they conquer? And one of the possible answers to that mystery is that they found kindred in the land of Canaan when they entered. It may be that what they found in Canaan were not racial kin, but people who were kindled by the ideology of Israel and saw in it something better.
Be strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You are to hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have until now. Joshua 23:6.
Joshua dies at the age of 110 and is buried at Timnath-Serah in the country of his own tribe. And so it is that the Bible describes one of the greatest holy warriors.
Joshua was the conqueror and the consolidator. I think Joshua's greatest trait was his faithfulness to the tradition he inherited and his passionate love for both God and for his own teacher Moses.
There have been attempts by some scholars to sort of try and show how Joshua was somehow a brilliant military strategist in the ways in which this campaign was conducted. The text is trying to say that this campaign was won not by your military brilliance, but by the power of God and your faith in that power.
So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. Joshua 6:27.
I'm Billy Ray Cyrus. Join me for an adventure into the hollers, an unforgettable look at the proud and tough history of Southern Mountain Hill folk. From the 1700s to the present.
Join Billy Ray Cyrus for Hillbilly, the real story.